This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me as ever is my co-host Tony Black. How are you doing, Tony?
I'm pretty good, Duncan, thank you. Or should I say, hark, the Duncan, thou ist pleasant on this morn. Could that be a clue as to what we're talking about today?
It could be a little bit of a clue, I suppose.
A terrible clue, a really bad clue.
Oh, well, yeah. Hail might have been better than hark.
Yeah, probably.
With a kind of Star Trek connection. Basically, yes, what we're talking about today is quite a big topic. It's Shakespeare in Star Trek. And we're going to kind of cover it in sort of two halves, take a bit of a two-act structure to this story. We're going to start off talking about the original series, and then we're going to talk about the sort of 80s, 90s onwards as a bit of a group in a sense. But I thought maybe what we could start off by looking at actually is, rather than kind of starting at the beginning and working our way forward, is to think a little bit about maybe the sort of quintessential Shakespeare in Star Trek, which I think is probably the Undiscovered Country. I mean, we talked a little bit in our third episode about the Wrath of Khan and some of the ways in which Nicholas Meyer brought kind of classic literature into that story and, brought in the stories from Moby Dick, brought in A Tale of Two Cities and so on, and some of those other texts that we talked about. And obviously, in some ways, in the Undiscovered Country, he sort of plays the same trick again. Particularly, he has this villain who is, not spouting lines from Moby Dick, but he's spouting lines from Shakespeare's plays in this quite kind of over-the-top, theatrical, entertaining way. So I thought maybe we could use that as a kind of way of sort of getting ourselves into this rather broad topic, and thinking a little bit about the ways that sort of Shakespeare works in that film and what it means to have brought it in that way. Yeah, and it's a really great and, classic example of how Shakespeare is interpreted in the Star Trek universe, in that, it's the line in the Undiscovered Country in which you haven't experienced Shakespeare unless it's in the original Klingon, which is brilliant because Shakespeare really, I mean, if there is a Star Trek race and there is a collection of people in Star Trek who link to Shakespeare in many respects most, it probably is the Klingons. It is that sense of, overblown theatricality that they have, as well as all the honor and the warrior stuff. They have noble houses, they have, families at war, they have this idea of, beauty of romances that cross the stars and are flamed by passion. People like Martok and Cirella and, Worf and Kayla and all, and going back, all these kind of characters. And then you've got these really powerful matriarchal warrior women like Lursa and B'Etor and all this kind of thing. And they really have a real Shakespearean sense to them as a race. And in the Undiscovered Country through Chang, it's really amplified through this idea of this strange concoction of a Klingon, an alien, spouting, cry havoc and let's slip the dogs of war. But it's done so well, and it's partly because it's Christopher Plummer, really, at the end of the day. But it fits, and it's really, really surprising just how well it actually works. It is, absolutely. And it does sort of seem to fit the Klingon character, you're right. It seems to fit that kind of slightly exaggerated, a little bit kind of over the top kind of, and also I suppose they're a warrior culture. They are a bit like a kind of, almost a sort of medieval human culture or something. There is something kind of a little bit ancient about them that it does seem to tie in very well, and particularly with the villain. I mean, I think there's an element of just the kind of theatricality of it. You know, these characters, you know, both Khan and Chang, these kind of larger than life characters, it gives them a sort of charisma. It gives them a kind of, it's not a million miles away from Captain Hook and a kind of moustache twirling, you know, sort of slightly over the top villain. But actually, in some ways, you know, maybe you need that. I mean, those are two of the most popular Star Trek villains that we have. If you think of, for example, Ruafo in Insurrection, you know, played by, again, a very, exactly, yeah, you know, I was going to say a very distinguished, you know, wonderful actor, F. Murray Abraham, but is just a really boring villain. And, you know, whatever you might say about Khan or Chang, they're never boring. They have they've got bucket loads of charisma, they've got a real kind of flair, and a lot of that does come from this kind of quotations that are put into their mouths that allow them to sort of soar in a way as their villainy kind of expands beyond the scope of the story that they're actually kind of living through. And the other thing is that, you know, another link between those two films is that basically, you know, that line, you haven't experienced Shakespeare until you've heard him in the original Klingon. Nicholas Meyer, in his autobiography, actually, he says basically he was inspired with that line by old kind of World War II films that he'd seen where the kind of evil moustache-twirling Nazi basically says the same thing about German. You know, you haven't experienced Shakespeare till you've heard him in German. But there's also an element, he is also playing the same trick that he did in The Wrath of Khan with the, you know, have you not heard of the old Klingon proverb about a dish that's best served cold, which in itself was an existing quotation, I think usually attributed to Laclos, the author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses. But in any case, it was a proverb that was in, you know, Nicholas Meyer didn't invent it, but he attributed it to the Klingons. And in the same way, he here is, you know, in this sort of joking way, attributing Shakespeare to the Klingons. And there's also the fact that the story behind it, if you read his book, is quite funny. I mean, you say, you know, it only works because it was Christopher Plummer. In fact, it was the other way around. Basically, what Nicholas Meyer claims, at least, is that he was writing this film, he'd written this villainous character. At the same time, he was listening to an audio CD of Christopher Plummer declaiming passages from Henry V with this kind of sweeping orchestral score underneath. And he just loved this CD he was listening to, and he started thinking to himself, I've got to get this guy in my film. I just want to be around this man. I just want to hear him. He said, this is a quote, he says, I dreamed of being around Plummer and hearing him spout Shakespeare with that trumpet voice, but how to get him to do it? All I could think of was using Shakespeare's words and sticking them in my villain's mouth. So then he came up with this whole idea, and this whole idea of the kind of Shakespeare themes in that film and the kind of, you know, the Chang character basically came from that. And it was this idea of like, how do I get Christopher Plummer into this film? Well, I know he likes Shakespeare, so maybe if I make half his dialogue lines from Shakespeare, then he'll agree to do it.
Well, it worked, and you know,
it did, yeah.
It's a great piece of casting and a great character. He quotes quite a lot of plays, doesn't he? He quotes Romeo and Juliet. He quotes Henry IV, Richard II, Julius Caesar. He quotes Hamlet, and I tell you what, Meyer is a bit obsessed with Hamlet, I think. I mean, he brings Hamlet up a fair few. I mean, the title, The Undiscovered Country, is from Act 3, Scene 1. You know, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. And even Dr. McCoy quotes Hamlet in The Voyage Home briefly, where he says, angels and ministers of grace defend us. Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, and it's great. So he's got a lot of love, I think, especially for Hamlet as well, which makes sense. You know, it's one of Shakespeare's biggest and, in many respects, for many, best plays. So, you know, but it's great the way, through mainly Chang, he manages to bring all these great classical Shakespeare references to bear.
Although it's interesting mentioning Hamlet, you know, the other, you know, wonderful performance in that film, of course, is the performance of David Warner. And listeners might not be aware of this. I mean, I wasn't aware of this until I sort of started reading up about Shakespeare in production history. But in the 1960s, around the same time that Star Trek was debuting, David Warner was the iconic Hamlet of that generation. He played, I think he was the youngest person to have played Hamlet, basically. He performed in this very well-received production when he was 24. He played Hamlet as this kind of student prince, you know, very much a young man, very kind of relatable. And it was a real sort of turning point for the theatre. This was for the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford upon Avon, but it was really a big part of this project to make Shakespeare accessible to all people, particularly to younger people. And David Warner was absolutely instrumental in that. You know, one of the things, if you read some of the accounts of those early performances of his, was that they discovered that in particular the soliloquies, and this was a real revelation, were kind of designed by Shakespeare in a sense for audience interaction, because the audiences, they weren't the kind of fusty traditional Shakespeare audiences who sat there kind of knowing the whole script in their head. They were treating it as a real story about real people, about this young man like them. And when Hamlet started soliloquizing, you know, for example, he says, "Am I a coward?" Someone from the back of the stall shouted out, "Yes!" And he discovered that he could play the entire soliloquy as a back and forth conversation with the audience, basically. And all these questions that Hamlet's asking himself, the audience are giving their views and their opinions and really kind of engaging with the play. So obviously in the kind of history of Hamlet in performance, David Warner was a big character, and Nicholas Meyer certainly was aware of that. He knew him as this kind of famous Shakespearean actor. And also, you know, actually William Shatner, the kind of third in that sort of triumvirate in that film, in a sense. We think of him, of course, as Captain Kirk. He's, you know, the rest of his career's obviously slightly overshadowed by Star Trek. But before that, he was quite a distinguished Shakespearean actor, and he and Christopher Plummer had actually worked together. They met in the 1950s when William Shatner was understudying Christopher Plummer at the Toronto Shakespeare Festival in Canada, and Plummer was playing Henry V, and Shatner was understudying for him. And apparently, Plummer got a kidney stone, I think, and you know, had to take some time off. And Shatner ended up going on, and in that kind of, you know, like those sort of stories that you hear from time to time, he was the understudy that kind of wowed everyone. And Plummer actually tells this story in his own autobiography. He says, "Shatner scored full marks as Henry, ignoring all my moves. He'd made sure to do everything I didn't do, stood up where I'd sat down, lay down where I'd stood up. I knew then that son of a bitch was going to be a star." So that was Christopher Plummer's kind of recollection, was that basically, you know, Bill Shatner was this sort of upstart, but you know, with a gift for Shakespeare. And certainly, I mean, we don't think of him as a Shakespearean actor, but, you know, if you look online, you can go on YouTube and see some of the clips of some of the Shakespearean roles that he played, you know, in the years before Star Trek. And that was a big kind of part of his past as an actor and of his background. So obviously you sort of see that in this film, that you have, you know, this film is really anchored by these three Shakespearean heavyweights, in a sense. And I think that does lend the film a kind of a certain gravitas. It also lends it a kind of, I mean, one of the things about Shakespeare, I suppose, is it's kind of heightened language, it's kind of heightened reality. And obviously with Star Trek, that's true as well. And particularly with a film like The Undiscovered Country, which has a kind of slightly sort of operatic scale to it, in a sense. I mean, as much as it's about contemporary politics and it's a kind of, you know, a sort of mystery and a thriller and so on, it also has this quite, particularly with the Klingon characters, this quite grand aspect and this you know, this kind of expansive style to it. And I suppose the other way of looking at it is, you know, obviously in that film, from a kind of contemporary point of view, the Klingons were standing in for the Russians, and maybe there's an element of that kind of Russian culture and the Russian kind of, the Russian soul as being this kind of quite broader and more kind of expansive than the kind of traditional sort of Western culture, in a sense, and that somehow something of that kind of plays into, as you were saying, these characters who are sort of larger than life, who have these kind of great passions and these great, you know, have a kind of swagger in a way that, you know, modern Americans or English people or, you know, whoever don't.
And that's what Mayer's really good at, you know. I mean, you see that in The Wrath of Khan, as we talked about a few weeks ago. You know, you see that in the character of Khan. He's enormously Shakespearean, even if he doesn't really quote Shakespeare like Chang. They are the same kind of either possessed zealot kind of bad guy, or just complete, you know, egomaniac, or somebody with a tragic arc. I wouldn't say Chang has the same kind of tragic, evil, you know, arc as Khan does, but they're both, like you're saying, larger than life, heightened reality characters who you can imagine saying these really grandiose, you know, verbose things, you know, like when Khan says, "I'll chase him around the moons of Nibia and around Antares flames," and all these kind of things that you could imagine coming from Shakespeare. And then when Chang obviously spouts these lines, it is of that same kind of style and feel. And coming from, you know, these kind of actors, David Warner, I love that guy. I mean, I've been a massive fan of David Warner for years. He you know, he's great as Gorkon in this. And, you know, again, it's not a Shakespearean role, but he's great as Gul Madred in Chain of Command in The Next Generation. Again, he has that you know, that level of you know, Shakespearean theatricality, and opposite Patrick Stewart, or obviously he's another Shakespearean legend. It works even better. But it's did you think, talking about Shatner though quickly, did you showed me the the old footage of him doing Julius Caesar's famous speech. And I've got to say, I thought he rushed it. I really did.
You didn't enjoy the kind of. Well, that's interesting. I thought he got a few kind of Shatnerian pauses in there as well, didn't he? You get a kind of cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. There's a kind of.
But then he was very quick.
He's got some of his ticks, but he was it's true.
So it was a bit
true.
of both, really. But and not that I can talk. I'm not. I've got a drama degree, but I'm not Shakespearean trained actor. The most I've done is As You Like It on stage. I've not done some of the big ones, but I've played Orlando as You Like It, which is very different from these very theatrical kind of characters. But it like I say, it works. It works very well, certainly in the context of that film.
Absolutely, yeah, and particularly with those actors, whatever the story behind how it came about, and whether you entirely believe what Nick Meyer says in his book about these various things, I think is slightly up for grabs. But definitely it works, and it definitely adds a lot to that story that I think another writer probably wouldn't have thought to put in there, or because it's quite cheesy, I suppose, as well. On the page, you kind of think, like, especially General Chang, it borders on the ridiculous. I mean, there's that quite funny line where McCoy basically he says, "I'd give real money to make that guy shut up." There's this kind of element of like this is self-indulgent and absurd, but at the same time with a performance that's strong and the kind of, as I said, this sort of operatic sensibility, it really works, and it kind of really does help sort of propel that film towards its climax, in a sense that you've got this larger-than-life character who's stomping around spouting Shakespeare. And actually, when you were saying he's quite like Khan, I mean, of course, Khan is very heavily, as we talked about in the previous, in episode 3, is very heavily based on Ahab in Moby Dick. Ahab in Moby Dick is a very consciously Shakespearean character. I mean, if you look at Moby Dick, there's a lot of kind of Shakespearean allusion in that novel. Melville was very definitely trying to sort of write a kind of a Shakespearean drama in prose, in a sense, when he wrote that book. So it's sort of no coincidence that those kind of larger-than-life characters find their way through, in one version after another, and in one adaptation after another, and one kind of reference after another, that those sort of qualities are still carried through one way or another.
Yeah, it's like a common thread, isn't it? It's a common thread that goes through, through literature, since Shakespeare obviously created his amazing plays, and it carries through into something ultimately like Star Trek, which on the face of it is something very, very distant and connected from what Shakespeare, was writing about. But then at the same time, it's not. It has a certain connection, and it's one of those. I think it's one of those fictional universes that actually, if it makes sense to include Shakespearean allusions in Star Trek, because Star Trek ultimately ends up being and as we talked about in the Khan episode, from Nick Meyer's influence heavily, it becomes a lot more of a cultural series. Having said that, though, there is quite a lot of it in the original 60s series, isn't there?
There is, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking, probably the big episode to talk about there is The Conscience of the King, quite an early episode, which, is actually about a troupe of Shakespearean players on the Enterprise. And, we mentioned this in one of our previous episodes. I think we sort of touched on the other side of this story, which is about this kind of genocide and the fact that the lead Shakespearean actor is, in fact, sort of in disguise, this awful mass murderer. But it's kind of leaving that to one side. There's also this whole story which is about this troupe of players basically coming onto the ship and performing their plays. And funnily enough, there is a sort of historical basis for this. There were instances of Shakespeare's plays being performed on board ships at sea. There's quite famously, there was a performance in 1607 of Hamlet on a ship called the Dragon, and you can read the log of the captain of the Dragon. He says, "I invited Captain Hawkins to a fish dinner and had Hamlet acted aboard me, which I permit to keep my people from idleness and unlawful games or sleep." So there's this kind of discussion of this performance on board ship, and there's quite an interesting poem actually. This is a real digression, but there's a poem called Hamlet at Sea about exactly this, and it sort of imagines this scene where the captains of the two ships are there, and obviously Hamlet is a play that features a play within a play quite heavily, and they're sort of watching it. They're kind of almost becoming part of the play as the king and the queen of Denmark. In the poem, it talks a little bit about the rehearsal process for this play being performed on board, and all the the boys up in the rigging have even learnt all the lines, and everyone is absorbed in the sort of theatricality of it. And even the men on the other ship, that the captain who, in this historical log has come to see the performance, the men on his ship are just out of sight, and they just hear these kind of odd strains of this Shakespeare play drifting across the sea towards them. So it's this quite sort of beautiful image, in a sense, of this ship out at sea in the middle of nowhere, really kind of isolated and alone in a sense, but still partaking in this, this culture, in a sense, and that's exactly what we see in The Conscience of the King.
Yeah, and obviously The Conscience of the King is a line from Hamlet. One of the most famous lines. The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. So but the whole storyline within The Conscience of the King is obviously there's performances of Hamlet and Macbeth, and it's one of those very theatrical storylines in itself, isn't it? What's going on with Karidian, or as he's otherwise known, Kodos the Executioner, who Kirk obviously has this real, difficult moral, conundrum with, in trying to grasp whether or not this guy is a mass murderer. So it again, though, they cast an actor in Arnold Moss who plays him to be this very gravitas kind of performing actor, but he's hiding this really, really dark secret. And I think it's a really, again, heightened up theatrical, kind of storyline. And I suppose in the original series, it was a very heightened reality show, even more than some of the later Star Trek series, in a lot of these, quite grandiose storylines within science fiction in their own way. But something like this, it almost intentionally is playing off Shakespeare, isn't it? It's really sort of at the centre of the whole episode.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's a very clear parallel in this story, because the story of Hamlet is the king has murdered his brother, has murdered Hamlet's father, and Hamlet is kind of 99.9% sure that that's the case and that he should revenge himself on him. But typically Hamlet is doubting. He's not quite sure. He wants proof. And this line about the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king, that is the resolution to, in fact, the very soliloquy I was talking about earlier about, am I a coward, etc., is it's that basically he's going to prove Claudius's guilt by getting the players to perform before him a scene matching the murder that he committed, and then watching his reaction to it. And obviously, if he reacts in horror and in a way that indicates his guilt, then he'll know for certain that the king is guilty. And in the Star Trek story, it's there's a great similarity. I mean, Kodos is basically the Claudius, the king character who has this murder in his background. Captain Kirk is cast in the kind of Hamlet role, and unusually for Captain Kirk, he spends so much of the episode kind of doubting and not really acting. There are other people who are saying, it's him, we know it's him, it looks like him, it sounds like him, basically let's kill him, let's deal with him. And Captain Kirk is kind of saying, well, I'm not 100% sure, I'm not quite certain, yes, I think this is probably the same guy, but I can't quite be sure. And playing out really that kind of stereotype of Hamlet as the man who's afraid to act, who is kind of vacillating and soliloquizing and doubting and never quite doing anything. And it seems strange for Captain Kirk, who we think of as such a man of action. But actually, I was quite interested. There's an interview with Bob Justman, one of the early producers on Star Trek, and he actually says, he said that he found out quite early on, this is the quote, that Gene Roddenberry had based the character of Captain Kirk on two fictional characters. One of them was Hamlet, who doubted his ability to make happen what he knew he had to make happen, and the other was Captain Horatio Hornblower, who suffered for the suffering of the people under his command. And with those two people in the background, I understood completely who Captain Kirk was. And I think we've talked briefly before about the influence of Hornblower on Star Trek and the idea of Captain Kirk as inspired by this sort of swashbuckling naval captain. But actually, the fact that Gene Roddenberry saw him as equally influenced by the character of Hamlet, who, is a very principled, a very decent man, but essentially a man who is afraid to act, who is kind of uncertain about his own actions, is quite surprising. But it certainly gives you different insight into Captain Kirk's character, or at least into the kind of early ideas of who that character might be.
Yeah, it's one of those episodes that really does, like you say, something different with Kirk, and it stands out for that reason. In that it loses its way a little bit. I think towards the end, the conscience of the king. It gets a little bit histrionic, which perhaps it makes sense in the context of the very Shakespearean ideas and themes of the story involving Karidian's daughter and things like that. But Kirk, I think all the way through goes through this really interesting arc, and it shows a level of, introspective doubt and vulnerability you don't often see when he's off swaggering around the galaxy, charming women all the time, even though there is the romantic element to this. There's a real feeling that he's haunted by Kodos and affected by what happens in this episode, which, doesn't always happen. I mean this in the nicest possible way to the original series, but it doesn't always happen in terms of characterization in that show. But in this, you really get the feeling that by the end, he's really come away from it, having gone through something. And that's, ironically, perhaps the effect of something like a Shakespeare illusion and the story, really.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing is, once you start thinking of Kirk as this kind of Hamlet character, I mean, another thing that maybe is worth thinking about is the role of the captain's log in the original series. And I know a lot of people have often sort of joked about the captain's log in the original series. It doesn't seem to quite make sense. When is he recording these logs? There's a kind of logical inconsistency about the fact that he seems to be... The captain's log often appears to be basically his interior monologue. It seems to be something that's happening implausibly in the moment. It's not really a record that would be written after the fact, like a real log would be, like the log of the captain of the dragon that we talked about earlier. But actually, if you start thinking about the captain's logs as essentially a soliloquy, as a way of the captain expressing their doubts, expressing their feelings about the situation they're in, sort of seeking kind of a resolution, then it kind of puts a different inflection on it. And actually, Captain Kirk does have quite a few logs where that idea of doubt, that idea of questioning his actions, comes across quite clearly. I mean, on the bridge, he's very confident, he's very charismatic and so on. But in the privacy of his own quarters, in the privacy of his own log recordings, he often is questioning himself. I mean, I was looking at another episode that we might talk about a little bit later, Requiem for Methuselah. There's a log in that where he starts saying, have I made a terrible mistake? Have I made an error? I'm worried that I've done the wrong thing. In the episode Obsession, this is a quote from his log in that episode. He says, have I the right to jeopardise my crew, my ship, for a feeling I can't even put into words? Have I made a rational decision? I mean, these are exactly the kind of questions that someone like Hamlet asks all the time in that play. Am I doing the right thing? Have I made the right decision? Have I understood the situation correctly? Doubting everything, doubting himself, doubting his own sort of self-confidence. And it is very strange to think of Captain Kirk in that way, because it goes so much against the kind of cliche of who Captain Kirk is. But actually, if you look at the original series and you look at some of these early episodes, that is a kind of thread that has definitely been put in there one way or another.
Yeah, and it is surprising to go back and think of it in those terms with Kirk. Absolutely, it really is. But then if you look at the whole of the original series, it's surprising just how many... how much the influence of Shakespeare itself is. There's even to the point of like episode titles like Dagger of the Mind. I didn't realise that Dagger of the Mind was from Macbeth. Art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation? It's little things. Such as the three witches as well in Catspore, which are very reminiscent of the three witches in Macbeth. By any other name is from Romeo and Juliet. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It's remarkable, really, how much Roddenberry seemed to have Shakespeare on his mind when he was creating the original series.
Well, I mean, and we know from reading a little bit about Roddenberry, I mean, one of the things that alienated him, we talked about this, I think, a bit in a previous episode, alienated from the other pilots that he was serving with in the war, was he had a tendency to quote Shakespeare at them, which they found quite annoying. So we know that Roddenberry obviously was a big fan of Shakespeare. He was a big sort of admirer of Shakespeare's plays. And certainly in terms of the kind of the titles of the episodes, particularly the original series, and I suppose again in Deep Space Nine, we get the same thing. We get these very literary, slightly opaque sometimes titles. I'm thinking compared to like Next Gen and Voyager, where they're kind of, the cloud, the this, the that, they're quite sort of functional titles in a sense. But certainly in the original series, and again in Deep Space Nine, we get these kind of rather lofty titles that I suppose sort of plays into that idea that we talked about a bit with Nick Meyer before, of kind of trying to stake a claim to this as art, to stake a claim to this as something serious and creative and, something to be sort of taken seriously. And on occasion, borrowing whole plots from Shakespeare's plays. I mean, we talked about The Conscience of the King. Another example would be Elan of Troyes. I mean, Elan of Troyes is basically The Taming of the Shrew in space with added Klingons. So it's got a kind of a sort of action-packed element that the original doesn't have. But basically the whole, drama of that story is very much the drama of and the comedy of The Taming of the Shrew. And, it's, I don't know about you, it's not a favourite episode of mine particularly. I think the kind of sexual politics of that episode are, somewhat problematic, just as the sexual politics of the original play are problematic. But certainly it's sort of hard to miss that connection and that the fact that Kirk finds himself in the role of, dealing with this very strong-willed female character and trying to, to tame her in Shakespeare's terms.
It seems like an intentional thing that Roddenberry and the writers are trying to do, into actually, like you say, is to consider this an artistic approach with Star Trek and take a lot of these plays and try and if not rework them like in Elan of Troyes, but use elements from them or reference them in episodes. Like in Truth No Beauty, where there's references to the Tempest, which crops up, I think, again, in other episodes like Requiem from Methuselah. He's heavily borrowing from the Tempest. So there is an attempt, isn't there, to sort of take this classic, what is considered to be the most classic English literature, and port it into the Star Trek universe.
And I'd say, we talked a bit about Hamlet cropping up again and again in Star Trek. Really, The Tempest is, certainly for the original series, The Tempest is the play that is kind of repeatedly brought back and sort of, drawn on again and again. And in some ways, I think it's not surprising, because The Tempest is a play, it's about this kind of magical island. It's very much, we have the line in The Tempest, Brave New World, and we have in Star Trek, Strange New Worlds. It's almost the same concept in a sense. It's kind of almost built for that format, because it is all about going to this world where everything is mysterious and strange and different, and meeting the inhabitants of that world and the strange ways that they behave and the kind of magic that they perform, and the kind of interaction between one set of characters from kind of modern civilization and another set of characters from this kind of mystical, magical world. So it's not surprising in a sense that would find its sort of analogue in Star Trek. In fact, there's a man called A.D. Nuttall who wrote a book about Shakespeare, and he claimed, somewhat controversially perhaps, that Shakespeare essentially invented science fiction by writing The Tempest, that the debt that so much of science fiction owes to that play is so great that really you can see Shakespeare as the kind of creator of that genre, in a sense, writing a play about these very alien characters, writing a play about this very alien world. It's not just the kind of fairy world of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's something quite specific and quite different. And we see it, in Star Trek, even going back as far as the original pilot, The Cage. The Cage is a story very heavily influenced by The Tempest as well. Yeah,
it's fascinating how that would be ascribed to Shakespeare, science fiction. Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, really. And I think to put it front and centre in The Cage, is especially, it's almost brave in trying to create something new, but to have something so clearly literary and so clearly going back to something as famous as, obviously in the 1960s, Shakespeare was as famous as it is today. So it's almost brave actually taking, these components, as I say, and putting them into these classic episodes. And the question is, Duncan, does it work? In the context of these old episodes, in the original Star Trek, with episodes like The Cage and like the ones we've mentioned, does it heighten the drama? Does it make it more interesting, or does it feel like it's sort of trying to crib from something much greater than itself?
I think you sort of have to take each one on its own merits, in a sense. I think broadly speaking they work generally quite well. I think The Conscience of the King you can kind of enjoy even if you don't know that much about Hamlet, but maybe you enjoy it more if you know about Hamlet. I think with The Tempest it's more, it fits well because there is a kind of natural fit between those two things, and you could easily watch The Cage and know nothing about The Tempest, and you wouldn't be missing anything. The missing link there, of course, is also the film Forbidden Planet, which was very much an adaptation of The Tempest and also very much an influence on The Cage. In terms of the kind of aesthetic, in terms of some of the kind of characterization and so on, there's a kind of real debt, and maybe this is something we could look at in a future episode, the kind of relationship between The Cage and Forbidden Planet. So there's kind of a link in between there, but certainly if you think about kind of some of the themes of The Cage, some of what that episode is really about, these kind of big themes about illusion and reality, about freedom and imprisonment. And these are all themes that are very much there in The Tempest as well. You have this magician, Prospero, who has the power to create illusions. A lot of the comedy in The Tempest comes from the fact that the ordinary sort of civilized human, the characters from Milan have arrived, and their understanding of the world that they're witnessing is being affected by these illusions. They see, for example, one character sees lush green grass all around him and another sees an arid desert. Now, that's something that we see in Star Trek again and again, not just in The Cage, but, even in Emissary and Deep Space Nine or in The Man Trap, this kind of idea that, different people are kind of being granted a different vision or a different understanding of the same thing in front of them, this kind of power of illusion. And really that's what the Telosians in the cage, and obviously later in the menagerie, that's their power. And they talk a lot about it, about how the power of illusion has kind of corrupted their culture in a sense and left them unable to do anything else. And one of the big themes that runs all the way through the original series, and to some extent all the way through Star Trek, but certainly through the Captain Kirk character, is this idea that it's better, and Captain Pike in this story, it's better to face reality, however grim it is, than to live a comforting illusion. We see the same thing played out again and again in the original series, and we even see it in Generations, the same thing, that finally Kirk has sort of given into the fantasy, given into the illusion, and it takes a bit of nudging from Picard, but ultimately he rejects the illusion, just as Pike rejects the pleasant illusions in the cage. And there's this kind of debate in that episode about the aliens just don't understand. They think, well, if they make the illusion pleasant, if they make the prison desirable enough, if they gild the cage enough, why would anyone not want to live there? They can have everything they desire, they can have their dreams fulfilled, but at the same time there's this idea that human beings, that's not what we're about. We don't want that. We want gritty reality. We'd rather, get our feet in the mud and kind of, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps than we would, live this kind of idealized but imaginary, illusory world. So I suppose the cage, in a sense, ties those two themes together quite well. The theme of illusion and the theme of imprisonment, and certainly in the Tempest as well. You have, Prospero has these kind of two assistants in a sense. He has Ariel, who's the kind of airy spirit who does his bidding, and he has Caliban, who's this kind of more sort of deformed, kind of earthy character who also is basically a slave to him. So he has these two imprisoned slaves, both of whom, in their different ways, really kind of resent and rebel against their enslavement. And a big theme in the Tempest is, Ariel doing these deeds for Prospero in exchange for the fact that one day he's going to be freed, he's going to grant him his freedom. And obviously in the cage we see that that kind of debate played out over and over again about the importance for humans of being free and the struggle that these aliens have to understand that.
Yeah, and I suppose, talking about illusion as well, I suppose you can kind of draw a little bit of a parallel with, and obviously we touched on this most recently in a full episode, but the holodeck later on in Star Trek. You can talk, think of the idea of an illusory world, where you can lose yourself and you can become enveloped in something that isn't real. I suppose it's a sort of a natural extension of the kind of themes from the Tempest, really. It's sort of been playing out in different ways. So it seems to be definitely one of the most pervasive Shakespeare plays going all the way through Star Trek from the original series and through, into the next generation and beyond, really.
Absolutely. And just sticking with the original series for a minute, you mentioned, is there in truth no beauty? That's not an episode so much about illusion, but it is very much about appearance and the kind of power of the visual. And, it has this character who turns out to be blind. It has these aliens who are so sort of hideous or possibly so beautiful that they drive people mad with by the very sight of them. And again, in the Tempest, there's this kind of theme of the kind of madness that can be inflicted by this magic, torturing people with magic, making them feel like they're being pinched or making them... Ariel has this line about driving them mad. There's many lines over and over again in the Tempest about the sailors and so on being kind of driven mad by the illusions that they're witnessing and the kind of power to control someone else's perception and someone else's kind of mental state through these kind of magical means, which obviously is something that kind of crops up in Star Trek in different forms, in many ways, that people are kind of, put through the sort of mental ringer one way or another by alien technology or kind of, in a sense, alien magic.
I suppose, yeah, and that is an interesting recurring theme. The difference between science and magic, the difference between, the future science of the Federation and Starfleet and the magic you would see in Shakespeare, in old literature and things like that. It is that, and it's something you still see played around in science fiction even today. A good example, it's not Star Trek, but a good example is Lost. There were certain elements of Lost that were magic completely. Things like the frozen donkey wheel under the island and things like that. That is an equivalent. It is something that has no basis in the real world, but it is something that's played out for a very heightened, dramatic, epic effect. So it is interesting to see those parallels drawn and raising the question of what's the difference between the two. And obviously, ultimately, Star Trek goes on to be more scientific and, you know, a slightly more hard scientific and technobabbly as time goes on. But in the original series, it is very much there, isn't it? That idea of futuristic scientific magic.
And also, you know, quite sort of out there ideas in the original series. I mean, in the other episode that has a strong kind of Tempest vibe, Requiem for Methuselah, you know, we have this character, the kind of Prospero character in that story is this kind of ancient character who turns out to have been Leonardo da Vinci and Brahms and all these kind of historical figures and has lived for thousands of years and so on. And he's ended up on this planet kind of playing this role. And not so much in his case, it's not so much about illusion, but about this woman that he's created. He's created this kind of Miranda character, you know, Miranda being Prospero's daughter, who is this kind of very innocent, naive young girl who's been brought up on this world. She's the character who says, you know, oh brave new world. She's the one who's sort of in meeting the people from our world, in a sense, from civilized society, is kind of astounded, even though she's the one who's grown up kind of on the magical world. But in Requiem for Methuselah, you get very much this kind of this romance between her and Captain Kirk, and in the same way as in The Cage, you had a romance between Vina and Captain Pike that was based on illusion and a misunderstanding, and you know, in fact, she was this sort of deformed character and so on, and not who he was presented with, because he was presented with an illusion. And then at the end of The Cage, she actually is presented with an illusion of a sort of fictitious Captain Pike to make her happy, so that she has the partner of her dreams. In Requiem for Methuselah, the kind of Prospero character has created this robot woman that they all assume to begin with is real. She doesn't know she's a robot. No one else realises she's a robot until quite late on, by which point Kirk has basically already fallen in love with her. And there's this whole discussion about how she's the perfect woman. She combines this, they say she's got 17 or 18 degrees. She's very beautiful. She's kind of this idealised version of the ideal mate that's sort of been created in a sense, and she also kind of plays into this idea. There's quite an interesting sort of video essay you can watch. I think it's on YouTube, but certainly you can find it online easily enough. It's about what the guy who's produced it calls the born sexy yesterday trope, and it's something looking at science fiction, and particularly women in science fiction, through this idea that you see again and again and again these characters. The kind of obvious example is the woman in The Fifth Element, the Mila Jovovich character in The Fifth Element, who's both, you know, they're born yesterday, as in very naive, literally created, you know, during the course of the film, like a day old or whatever in that instance, but combines kind of being born yesterday, having this kind of naivety with this kind of real sexiness and this real kind of desirability to men. And you see that in The Tempest as well with Miranda. You know, she is this very naive character, but there's also this kind of innuendo around her when she sees Ferdinand, the man that she ends up marrying. She talks about, she says, he's only the second man I've ever seen, the first that e'er I sighed for. And, you know, that word sigh has a kind of, there's an innuendo there. There's a kind of orgasmic innuendo in the back of that as well. And we see that very much with Vina, who's this kind of naive but desirable character. We see it very much with this perfect woman in Requiem for Methuselah. And, you know, and really that kind of trope, in a sense, certainly goes all the way back to Shakespeare and gets played out in Star Trek, you know, again and again in that way.
Yeah, and it almost feels like a little bit that one of the things that the writers are playing with, apart from the whole idea of, you know, the kind of romantic entanglements that, you know, Shakespeare enjoyed, you know, within his plays quite often, and that level of misunderstanding and everything, but it almost feels like the writers are playing with the idea of temptation in a way, and the idea of, you know, these people are out there crusading the galaxy, exploring, you know, instead of the brave new world, the strange new worlds, as you said earlier. But the idea that there is always something to test their resolve, whether it's a beautiful woman, whether it's this promise of a you know, an illusion, whether it's this, you know, this perfect romantic coupling, or whatever it is, it's sort of testing their ability to keep going, to continue this 5-year mission, to continue going out there. It's like a constant sort of, you know, apple in the Garden of Eden test, and it's really interesting how that sort of he's played through these Shakespearean illusions, and it seems to be a recurring kind of trope.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of almost this kind of idea of kind of like a happy retirement or something. Certainly that's the way it plays out in Generations, isn't it? Is Kirk has basically retired, and in the end he says to Picard, you know, don't ever let yourself, you know, don't get promoted, don't do anything that takes you off that bridge. Basically, don't ever stop working, essentially, is what he's saying. Yeah. You know, and it's funny because literally in The Cage, which is like the, you know, first ever sort of original Star Trek story, and in Generations, which in a sense is the last, very similar story taking place. You know, both Captain Pike and Captain Kirk, they get the woman of their dreams, and they get a horse, and that's the kind of combination, this kind of perfect lifestyle that is supposedly what every captain wants. They don't really want to be out exploring the galaxy and living this dangerous life. And obviously in the cage, Captain Pike, in the beginning of that episode, he's had this bad experience. He's lost several members of his crew. He's kind of feeling pretty exhausted and kind of wrung out. So there's that temptation there to kind of, throw it all in and resign and kind of jack in his career and so on. But there's definitely this sort of idea of what this sort of idealized retirement is. And it's very kind of quiet and, there's a romantic element and there's a kind of bucolic element in a sense. And those are the things that they're being offered, which I suppose it is exactly what Ferdinand gets when he lands on the island in the Tempest. In a sense, he gets this, this beautiful, magical world, and he gets this perfect woman to settle down with as well.
Doesn't sound all that bad, really, I have to say.
No, it could be worse. Definitely. And one of the things that's interesting about The Tempest is it's not just the original series that it's influential on. It's something that really has an influence all the way through Star Trek. And in our next episode, we're going to come back and look at some of the ways that Shakespeare is handled in The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and so on, in the kind of the second era of Trek in a way. And we'll find that amongst various other Shakespearean allusions, that play is certainly very much centre stage once again. But talking about Shakespeare in Star Trek is not the only thing we've been doing this week, so here's a look at some of the other things you might have missed on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
It was a really great police song for sure. Droxine! Yeah, I don't know. That's the one where Leonard Nimoy was singing backup with Sting on that.
Yeah, I can picture Droxine. Yeah. You don't have to put on the Z-Night. It doesn't have
to be every 7 years.
Standard Orbit.
The inscription of this book is a quotation from David Gerrold, which is something he said to me in an email. And he didn't even remember saying it. I met him recently and showed it to him, and he was like, "Oh, wow, that's a pretty good quote. I didn't know I said that." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, you did." But he said, "The primary philosophy in Star Trek, stripped of everything else, was love one another." I think Jesus might have said something like that once, too.
The Orb.
When something has lasted 50, 60, 70 years by the time you use it, it's already overcome that obstacle of being dated. Like, that it's going to remain important through the years. And the fact that someone in the 24th century might still be listening to it, I think makes a lot of sense.
Warp 5.
So we need to hire some samurai to defend us. So they go out looking for some samurai, and they find a group of
about 7 of them.
Yeah, like 7 samurai who are, maybe down on their luck.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.
Thou art the runes of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy, which like dumb mouths do ope the ruby lips to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. Curse shall light upon the limbs of men. Domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Italy. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar. The mother shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war. Oh, pity choked with custom of fell deed. And Caesar's spirit, ranging for revenge with Ate by his side, come hot from hell, shall in these confines with a monarch's voice cry, havoc, and let slip the dogs of war that this foul deed shall smell above the earth with carrion men groaning for burial.